April 16, 1945. Oder River Line, east of Berlin. The night over the Oder River felt as if the entire continent was holding its breath. Along the soaked riverbanks, where mud clung to boots and cold fog drifted like low smoke, thousands of Soviet soldiers waited in absolute stillness. The distant groan of artillery tractors rolled across the darkness. Engines coughed. Water slapped softly against pontoons. Every sound felt small compared to the weight of what was coming. Major Alexei Morozov stood among his men with his coat pulled tight and his eyes on the far ridge. For the last 2 days, he had carried a secret he could not speak of. He had been summoned, questioned, and returned without explanation. His men whispered theories, secret orders, punishment, promotion, interrogation. Only Alexei knew the truth, and even he did not understand it fully. A sealed envelope pressed against his chest under his uniform. Private orders. For his eyes only. At exactly 3 a.m., the horizon erupted. A wall of fire tore open the night as Marshal Zhukov unleashed one of the largest artillery barges in the history of warfare. The sky glowed bright white. The earth shook under the weight of thousands of guns firing at once. Trees snapped. Smoke and dust blew across the plains in thick waves. The soldiers on the riverbank watched in stunned silence as entire sections of the ridge disappeared behind a rolling storm of flame. The air itself seemed to shudder. But as the thunder rolled across the water, Alexei felt something cold and wrong settle inside his stomach. The barrage was not landing where it should. The pattern was off. The impact line was too far north. The strongest German fortifications on the Seelow Heights remained untouched and fully intact behind a curtain of smoke that hid everything except the faint glow of their defensive fires. Someone had fed the Red Army the wrong coordinates. Alexei grabbed his field radio and tried to reach headquarters. Static swallowed his words. He tried again. Nothing. The line was silent. Either the signal was jammed or someone wanted it that way. The barrage continued for 90 straight minutes. Fire, thunder, shock waves. But the truth remained unchanged. The Soviet guns were pounding the wrong position, while the true German line waited untouched. When the last batteries fell silent, a thick quiet spread across the plains. A quiet so unnaturally heavy that even the fog seemed to pause. Before the story continued, the narrator's voice deepened. Before we move deeper into this forgotten chapter of the war, take a moment to subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files. This is where the hidden side of history finally receives a voice. And in the comments, share where you are watching from. Texas, Berlin, Nairobi, Sydney. I read every single comment. Then silence again, a silence that felt too thin to support the weight of the coming storm. At dawn, Soviet whistles cut through the mist. Infantry surged forward into the open ground. The first men made it only a few steps before sinking waist deep into freezing water. Hours earlier, German engineers had opened the Oder's floodgates. The plains had transformed into a swamp of black water and sucking mud. Machine guns opened fire from hidden nests on the heights. The first wave fell. The second wave tripped over the wounded and drowned in the mud. The fog hid the gun barrels, but not the flashes. Shapes moved. Men stumbled. Shouts echoed through the mist. The swamp swallowed boots, then legs, then lives. Alexei pushed forward through the icy sludge, dragged by responsibility and by the sealed envelope in his jacket that felt heavier than any weapon. Every step was a battle against mud and terror. The Soviet front line dissolved into chaos as bullets snapped over helmets and water splashed with every falling soldier. Small groups of Soviet infantry tried to fan out, but the Germans had sighted their machine guns perfectly on the narrow sections of dry ground. Every path forward became a killing field. Mortars boomed from the heights. Fire exploded from a ridge. The thunder of German guns echoed over the water like steel doors slamming shut. Alexei tried the radio again, but the static remained unbroken. There was no command line, no confirmation, no explanation, only unanswered questions. Why were the Germans fighting so fiercely for a ridge they could not possibly hold? Why had someone sabotaged the Soviet coordinates? Why were the retreating German units falling back in perfectly timed intervals? as if protecting something far more important than the ground itself. Fog drifted across Alexei's path as he led a pocket of survivors toward a small rise in the terrain. A Soviet runner splashed toward him, soaked and breathless. The young soldier thrust a folded slip of laminated paper into Alexei's hand before collapsing into the mud. The message was not from Soviet command. It was written in a hand Alexei did not recognize and stamped with no official seal. There was only a single line: "Do not let Berlin fall too quickly." Alexei stared at the words as the battlefield roared around him. Behind the fog, the heights burned with scattered pockets of fire, and something deeper, something concealed, was being protected at an unimaginable cost. He looked toward Berlin, then down at the slip of paper, then at the envelope pressed to his chest. The war, it seemed, was not the only thing reaching its final hour. He pressed forward through the swamp with a growing sense of unease. Soviet armor clanked behind him. Explosions tore apart the water. German guns raked the advancing forces. The air smelled of wet earth, gunpowder, and fear. By late morning, the first Soviet tanks tried to climb the slippery slopes toward the German line. Mud swallowed their tracks. Many bogged down. Others burned where they stood. The heights were still alive with fire, untouched by the barrage that should have silenced them at dawn. Alexei searched for an explanation, but the battlefield offered only fragments. A German machine gunner firing until his last belt ran dry. A hidden sniper firing from a shattered barn window. Engineers retreating in small groups, placing charges with deliberate precision. The Germans were buying time. Not ground, not victory. Time. The question was why. The answer waited somewhere ahead, buried under smoke and mud, and Alexei would soon discover it. The heights loomed closer with every struggling step, but the mud seemed determined to hold Alexei in place. For hours, the incoming fire never slowed. German shells crashed into the water with towering plumes. Mortar flares drifted through the fog like dying stars. Every explosion revealed glimpses of desperate Soviet troops fighting to gain a few more yards. The attack had stalled across the entire front, yet the Germans continued to retreat in patterns that felt calculated rather than chaotic. By midday, the swampy plains had become a graveyard of shattered vehicles and broken bodies. Soviet officers shouted orders across the waterlogged field. Engineers ferried makeshift bridges through the muck. Tank crews prayed that their machines would not sink before reaching a slope. Every inch forward cost blood. Alexei climbed a small ridge with a handful of survivors who had managed to make it through the worst of the swamp. As he reached the top, the fog thinned, offering him his first clear look at the Seelow Heights. Smoke rolled across the high ground like black waves. Fires burned in broken trenches. German figures moved in small clusters, pulling carts, carrying crates, and blowing explosive charges behind them. This was not a typical retreat. It had rhythm, precision, intent. Alexei paused, narrowing his eyes. The Germans were leaving behind no random debris, only empty positions, collapsed tunnels, and scorched parapets. They were clearing a path, not abandoning it. The runner's message pressed against his memory. Do not let Berlin fall too quickly. A warning from someone with insight that stretched beyond the battlefield. The sealed envelope in his jacket felt heavier, the weight of a truth he had not yet confronted. He pressed forward, feeling the battlefield change around him. The Germans were still resisting, but their resistance had a pulse that throbbed with purpose rather than desperation. Every delayed explosion pushed the Soviets back for a moment, but each one also closed a passage or collapsed a trench behind the retreating German units. The Germans were sealing something. As Alexei advanced, he moved through areas where German troops lay still, their last round spent. He passed shattered houses, turned into firing posts, abandoned dugouts with maps still pinned to the walls, field telephones cut clean through, boxes emptied, papers missing, a withdrawing army determined to erase a story before anyone else could read it. Near mid-afternoon, the Soviet assault finally gained momentum along a shallow slope. Tanks pushed through a weak point and began climbing toward the ridges. Infantry followed in scattered waves, desperate to reach the heights before the Germans could set off more charges. Alexei hurried to keep up. The air shook with explosions behind him as German engineers collapsed more tunnels. Stones rained down. Smoke poured from the openings. The earth trembled under his feet. Something was being buried. Something important. As the line shifted, Alexei and a group of infantrymen reached a narrow trench that wound toward a damaged bunker partially hidden by debris. The entrance had been blasted open by the earlier barrage. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything except the faint flicker of dying light bulbs. Alexei stepped inside. The bunker smelled of dust, oil, and something older. Paper. Burned paper. The floor was littered with ash. Walls were marked with chalk symbols. Tables lay overturned. Cabinets stood open with drawers emptied. Only a few fragments remained, scattered near the far wall. Alexei walked deeper, boots crunching over debris. The flickering light bulbs hummed overhead as he approached a metal table that had been bolted to the floor. On it lay a set of charts left behind in a frantic retreat. The charts did not show trenches. They did not show artillery ranges or fallback positions. They showed corridors, long, winding tunnel networks beneath the Seelow Heights, arrows pointing westward toward Berlin, notes written in German script, symbols marking access points, and at the bottom of the largest map, stamped in fading ink, were the words, Evacuation Priority, Category Red. Alexei stared at the stamp as the bunker lights flickered again. Category Red, a designation he had never seen in any intelligence briefing. It suggested something more than documents, something more than supplies, something critical. He reached for another fragment lying under the table. A torn file cover, half-scorched. On the back, barely visible, were references to underground vaults beneath the Reich Chancellery. Vaults that connected to the tunnel system marked in the bunker. Vaults that the Germans were trying to protect, not from destruction, but from discovery. He reached for his jacket and pulled out the sealed envelope he had been carrying since his secret summons. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. The envelope had no official insignia, only a handwritten instruction on the front. Open only when the path reveals itself. He hesitated, listening to the bunker creak. Outside, artillery thunder shook the ground. The battle was still raging, but whatever the Germans were protecting had already begun to slip deeper into history. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sentence. If Berlin falls too quickly, our objective will be lost forever. Alexei read it again. The words hit him with a force that felt heavier than the artillery above. His mission was not to accelerate the Soviet advance. It was to slow it, to delay the fall of Berlin, to allow time for something else to unfold. He was working against the very victory his comrades were dying to achieve. The truth struck him with icy clarity. Whatever the Germans were evacuating through these tunnels was important enough for someone in Soviet command to sabotage the entire battle plan. He folded the paper and placed it back in his jacket, suddenly aware of how small he felt inside the bunker. Smoke seeped through the entrance. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The ground shook again. A final German charge detonated somewhere near the far ridge. The explosion tore through the earth with a violent roar. The tunnel mouth at the rear of the bunker collapsed. Dust and stones fell in a heavy cascade, sealing the passage forever. Alexei stepped backward as the smoke rolled in. The Germans had destroyed the last access point. Whatever had moved through these underground corridors was gone. He stood in the doorway, watching the smoke drift over the ruined landscape. The truth of the Seelow Heights was not about the ground gained or lost. It was about a timeline the Germans were desperately trying to protect and a timeline someone inside the Soviet command was trying to influence. The mystery deepened, and time was quickly running out. The heights were breaking. The roads to Berlin were opening, and the truth was slipping through the last cracks in the earth. Alexei stepped out of the bunker, the weight of two secrets pulling at him from opposite sides of history. Behind him, the tunnels crumbled into silence. Ahead, Berlin burned on the horizon. The smoke hanging over the Seelow Heights thickened as the afternoon light dimmed through the drifting clouds. The battle had reached its breaking point. Soviet armor pushed forward in a grinding advance that shook the ridgelines. German defensive guns cracked under the pressure. The ground trembled as explosives detonated across the hillside. Every explosion marked the collapse of another tunnel, another entrance sealed, another secret buried. Alexei reached a rise overlooking the southeastern slope. From there, he could see the entire battlefield stretching back toward the flooded plain. The swamp below glimmered under scattered fires. The silhouettes of fallen vehicles jutted from the water like the skeletons of metal beasts. Smoke drifted over the river as Soviet reinforcements crossed makeshift bridges under constant fire. The battlefield had become a blurred mosaic of motion and ruin. German units continued their retreat, but the retreat was too orderly to be a collapse. Small groups moved westward in tight formations, stopping only long enough to detonate charges behind them. Every withdrawal closed another corridor. Every corridor brought them closer to Berlin. The Germans were not fleeing. They were escorting something. Alexei felt it with a certainty he could not explain. Whoever orchestrated the underground evacuation had planned it long before the Soviets reached the Oder. The sealed tunnels behind him confirm it. The torn maps confirm it. The sentence in his pocket confirmed it. If Berlin falls too quickly, our objective will be lost forever. A cold wind swept across the ridge as Alexei descended the slope to a cluster of abandoned firing posts. Soviet troops rushed past, shouting orders and carrying ammunition crates. Officers pointed toward the heights, urging their men forward as the German line fractured under the combined pressure of tanks and infantry. The final phase of the battle had begun. Alexei slowed his pace as he reached an area where the earth had cracked from repeated detonations. The ground was split open in long, jagged lines. Smoke rose from the fissures. The faint echo of collapsing tunnels whispered beneath the surface like a distant underground storm. He knelt and placed a hand on the dirt. It vibrated with the fading movements of a world sealing itself shut. The Germans were not trying to stop the Soviets from reaching Berlin. They were trying to stop the Soviets from discovering whatever lay beneath it. He stood again and watched as the Soviet tanks advanced along the ridge. Their engines roared as they navigated the shattered slopes. Flames flickered from their exhausts. Machine gun fire rattled across the heights. Every step forward cost more lives. Yet the advance did not stop. Nothing could stop it now. By late afternoon, the Seelow Heights finally cracked under the weight of Soviet momentum. The last German positions fell one after another. Soviet flags rose over the ridge. Soldiers cheered with exhausted voices. For many, the battle had ended in victory. For others, it ended in mourning. For Alexei, it ended in questions. He walked along the ridge crest as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Smoke curled upward like dark ribbons. Berlin glowed faintly in the distance, illuminated by fires that burned through entire neighborhoods. The city waited like a final chapter that no one was ready to read. Alexei paused at a collapsed trench filled with debris. Something metallic glinted beneath a layer of dirt. He brushed it aside and uncovered a small metal container crushed by the force of the collapse. The lid had been bent open, but inside he found a single torn document fragment. German writing, part of a list, but most of the names were missing. Only faded traces of ink remained. He held the fragment in the fading light. It was impossible to determine what the list had once been. Personnel, objects, files, something that needed to be moved fast enough to justify sealing an entire underground network. Something important enough to influence a Soviet officer's secret mission. Something important enough for both sides to hide. Alexei let the fragment fall back into the trench. It vanished into the rubble as if swallowed by the earth itself. The wind carried the distant rumble of artillery from deeper west. The road to Berlin was opening. The final offensive was approaching. The truth that lay beneath the Seelow Heights had already disappeared into the collapsing underground maze. Whatever the Germans had sent westward through those tunnels had escaped the battlefield long before the first Soviet shells landed. He felt the weight of the sealed order again in his pocket. The words echoed in his mind. If Berlin falls too quickly, our objective will be lost forever. Someone in Soviet command had anticipated this. Someone had known about the underground evacuation. Someone had wanted the advance slowed to ensure that whatever the Germans were moving would not be captured or revealed. The implications stretched far beyond the battlefield. Night crept across the ridge. Fires glowed like scattered embers on the horizon. Soldiers moved in small groups to establish temporary positions. Medics treated the wounded. Engineers cleared paths for vehicles. The scene felt strangely calm for such a devastating battle. A calm born from exhaustion rather than peace. Alexei stepped away from the main encampment and found a quiet section of the ridge overlooking the ruined plain. The flooded ground shimmered under the rising moon. Smoke trailed from burning vehicles. The heavy silence felt almost unnatural. The night before the assault had been filled with tension and expectation. Now the air was filled with a different kind of silence. A silence shaped by victory but carved from loss. A silence that carried secrets no one could yet understand. He lowered himself to the ground and rested against a broken tree trunk. The weight of the day pressed into his bones. The secrets in his pocket felt heavier still. As he closed his eyes for a moment, he could still hear the echoes of detonating charges inside the tunnels. The sound of something ancient being buried beneath layers of earth and time. History would one day remember the battle as the final Soviet push toward Berlin. It would remember the heights, the casualties, the scale of the artillery, the final drive to end the war in Europe. But it would not remember the hidden corridors beneath the battlefield. It would not remember the vanished maps. It would not remember the lists. Those pieces had already disappeared in the smoke. A soldier approached to give him an update on the next day's movements. But Alexei barely listened. His eyes stayed fixed on Berlin. Smoke drifted upward from the city, as if signaling the end of an era. But endings had beginnings buried deep beneath them. He wondered what beginnings had vanished today beneath collapsing earth. As night settled fully over the ridge, Alexei rose again and walked a few more steps toward the crest. He looked at Berlin one last time. Fires flickered across the horizon. Light glowed behind drifting smoke. Somewhere beneath that burning city lay the vaults the Germans had tried to protect. Somewhere beneath those vaults lay a truth the Soviets had been instructed not to find. History had turned another page, but a chapter had been torn from its binding. The narrator's voice lowered with the weight of everything left unspoken. If this story carried you into the shadows of the war and revealed the secrets buried under its final battles, share it with someone who loves history. Like the video to help it reach more viewers. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from. Every place, every voice. I read them all. And if you want more stories that dive into the hidden corners of World War II, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files. Your support keeps these forgotten moments alive. The ridge fell silent. The night continued to burn. The truth slid deeper underground, waiting for someone bold enough to uncover it.